Welcome, everybody, to today's session. I'm just going to give a little bit of time for people who are coming into Zoom to join us. We are going live in various places as well, and that all seems to be working. I'll have to see how well I can manage, as always, the comments and the questions. But it's great to see lots of you joining us on the various different platforms. Excuse me. Okay, cool. Right. Welcome to this Slips, Trips and Falls open Q&A session. Ask me anything about slips, trips and falls. For those that don't know me, I'm Christian Harris. I'm the founder of Slip Safety Services. I've worked in the field of slip, trip and fall prevention for about the last 12 years. And in that time, my team and I have helped several thousand sites to reduce the risk and number of slip, trip and fall accidents, injuries and claims. And at last count, we think we're stopping about £10 million of claims a year. And today I'm delighted to see lots of you on this session. We're going to have a open Q&A session. You can ask me anything you like about slips, trips and falls. And what I've done is I've actually prepared some questions that we can potentially look to answer as a starting point, just because I know, actually, let me just share this way rather than that way. I know that sometimes people are a little bit nervous about asking questions. So what I've done is I've created here a nice screen full of numbers and colours. And what you can do, I'm just looking for one volunteer to get us started on this, to ask me in the chat, wherever you are watching this, give me a number between 1 and 9, and I will answer that question to start with, to start us off. And then as I'm answering that question, please feel free to fire in any questions into the chat box that you want to ask about slips, trips and falls. Or if you're on the Zoom, you can go into reactions and raise your hand, and then I will call you up at the appropriate time and you can ask me your question live in as close to real life as we can get when we're doing a webinar. So who's going to, here we go, perfect. So Gerald has very kindly given me number 7. So through the wonders of technology on my PowerPoint, I'll delete the number 7 and uncover the question. How can we get buy-in from the business to take slips and trips more seriously? Just for context, what I've done here is I've accumulated 9 questions that I often get asked, and therefore I thought they'd be good ones to answer until people are feeling brave and have their own questions to ask me. So how can we get buy-in for the business to take slips and trips more seriously? It's a great question, because unless we can get that buy-in, then we're almost doomed to failure, because to really solve these issues correctly and in depth and successfully, we do need to do things that aren't just simple, basic, little, small changes. I'm not saying that these issues require wholesale changes and massive business change. Far from it. But we're talking about subtle things we can do, but they're not simple things that we can do, and we can achieve those without the buy-in of the business. So when it comes to getting people to care about topics related to health, safety and risk, I always say you've got to get people to care through the message that you deliver. And I use an acronym for this. Let me see if I can remember it now. It's CARE, C-A-R-E. So you need a message that is crafted, so well thought through, thinking at things from different angles, written or otherwise communicated concisely and in the right kind of method for the audience that are listening. A is attention grabbing, so we need to get people's attention. When it comes to slips, trips and falls, this can be difficult because everyone is aware of the risk, but not everybody thinks the risk is very important. So it's a kind of kick the can down the road. It's a mañana kind of problem for lots of people. So we need to grab their attention. We can do that through stories, which is very powerful. Um, we can do it through logical things like data, but we need to try and grab people's attention. And attention is the currency that's the most valuable thing in the world in many respects. R is relevant. So we need to make the message relevant to the people or person or audience that we're speaking to. If you think about how to engage somebody on the shop floor, for want of a better term, in the importance of preventing slips, trips, and falls, the types of things we're going to be talking about and the medium that we present our information through to that audience is going to be very different to the types of messages we want to share and the way that we would share those messages to members of the board, for example. And then E in care is emotive. So bringing it to life through storytelling is really powerful, through making it resonate to that audience in such a way that it kind of it cuts through the logical part of the brain and overcomes that kind of resistance of it being a tomorrow problem or a kick the can down the road kind of issue into something that they see is important, is serious, and is something that we should be dealing with now rather than waiting. So I would always advise people to use that acronym of CARE, CARE, crafted, attention grabbing, relevant, emotive, and that is a good way of getting buy-in for this issue from people throughout the business as well as other stakeholders. Do type in some more questions for me in the chat, or if you don't have a specific question, feel free to give me a number in the chat wherever you are, and we'll move on to that question next. The other thing I would just say around getting buy-in is that you can also leverage some third-party heft here. So, particularly if you're in a big organization, your insurance company and your insurance broker is going to be very aware that slips, trips, and falls is a problem. Because if you think about it, whilst at an individual site level, you might say we haven't had any incidents or it's not really a risk for us. These organizations are so big, they're so vast that they are insuring hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of sites. And therefore, although the problem of slips, trips, and falls is sort of thinly spread, they see the accumulation of those issues. So one of the strategies that you can use to in a bigger organization to get buy-in is to try to partner up with your insurance company or your broker, and that can unlock support from a third party, which sometimes is more impactful, shall we say, than you're asking for something. But it can also unlock funding as well. So there are these things called risk management bursaries, which can fund risk management activity, and we do a lot of work with insurers around slips, trips, and falls prevention, where the insurance companies fund the work. Okay, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. Appreciate those through the chat. What is the average payout of a claim? Very relevant question, and that actually feeds back through to what we were just talking about in terms of how can we get buy-in. One of the ways we can get buy-in is to talk about the financial cost as well as obviously the human cost. So if we're looking at slips, because I know these numbers are a bit better than I do trips, but I think the numbers are relatively similar. The average cost of a claim has increased over the last few years because we've had this trend of claims inflation. We're seeing inflation in all walks of life, and claims inflation is no different, driven by some of the same drivers as normal inflation, costs going up, but there's also some other things going on. So a few years ago, I would have said it would be about £10,000 would be average, and that's slightly higher for a member of staff average claim, and potentially slightly lower for a member of the public average claim cost. But that's kind of crept up, and it's a bit closer to 15k now. So if you think of it this way, every incident is a potential 15K bill to your business, and that is a way of opening people's eyes. Now, you might say, "Oh, we've got insurance, and that's why we've got insurance because it covers those costs." And yes, it does cover those costs in the short term, but obviously, if you have claims on your insurance policy in any given year, the following year, the insurance company is in business to make money. So the following year, your premium is going to go up in line with the claim costs that you've suffered from. So it is something that is important to know. Yes, we can transfer that risk away to an insurer in the short term, but in the long term, all of these costs will start to add up. And the other thing I would say just on this is that there are hidden costs and uninsured costs as well. So not every single cost to your business from a slip or trip accident is a cost that is recoverable through your insurance policy, even if you have fully insured coverage for a slip and a trip. So we need to think about that. We also need to think about the fact that you may well have an excess. So if you think about your car insurance or your home insurance, I think for me on my car insurance, I have an excess of £150. So any claim I make, the first £150 I have to pay, and then the insurance company steps in over that £150 mark. It could well be, and particularly in larger organizations, we see this, that your insurance has an excess anyway. And so if your excess was 25K, for example, then a 15K claim is going to be covered in full from your bottom line rather than it being paid for by your insurance company anyway. So I hope that covers the average payouts of claims. Another question in the chat. What's the most common cause of slips, trips, and falls? Very big question. The first thing I would say to answer this, and do keep the questions coming in, guys, or if not questions, then give me another number and I'll answer that. We're going to aim to do about half an hour or so today. The first thing I'd say is we need to, although I'm talking today about slips, trips, and falls, when we're looking at causation and we're looking at solutions, we need to split these things out. So if we have a problem with people slipping, the way we would deal with that is different to if we had a problem with people tripping. And the causes of someone slipping are different to the causes of someone tripping. So that's the first thing to say. And falls in this context are caused by a slip or a trip. So we're not talking about falls from height. Let's start with trips. What are the most common causes? Well, the very simple answer to what is the cause of a trip is that there is a low level obstruction on the floor that somebody either doesn't see or isn't able to avoid. Their foot strikes it and then they trip. So that's the definition of a trip. What are those low level obstructions? And that's where the intricacies come in. It could vary from items that are fixed obstructions or long-term obstructions, such as curbs or a pothole would be a longer-term obstruction. It's not something that just appears out of the blue and is unexpected. Or we have things that are unexpected, short-term, temporary hazards, such as a box left on the floor or a trailing cable or something like that. When I look with clients at accident and claims data, we tend to find a good mix between the kind of intrinsic, longer-term fixed hazards, such as the potholes and the curbs, and the temporary hazards, such as the trailing cables, etc. Now, when it comes to how do we deal with those, then obviously they again need a different approach. The hazards that are longer term and they're almost fixed and they're just there, it's a case of, right, we need to be able to understand what they are and spot them, and then empower our teams to be able to do something about it. So if there's a pothole, give them a way of filling that pothole in, and then that eradicates the risk. If it's the temporary short-term type of hazard, then we need to be thinking about awareness around what activities are we doing that could be causing these, and how can we try to alleviate that, either through changing our way of working or through raising awareness and paying more attention. Because if we could get rid of all those temporary hazards, if they weren't hazards, if they were never put in place by humans typically, then these trips wouldn't happen. When it comes to slips, a slip is typically caused by some kind of contamination being present between a floor and a heel striking that floor. Most commonly, that contamination is on the floor, but we mustn't forget that the contamination could also be on the heel. So when someone walks in from outside, the floor in a reception area may well be dry, but if the foot is wet, then you could still slip. So in terms of the most common causes, it would be things like water or coming in from entrances, spillages of water or other liquids in areas like food courts, and then contamination buildup, other types of contamination in other areas. So you could have grease in a kitchen, you could have body fats or oils or talcum powder in a kind of leisure setting. You could have dust in a kind of construction type setting because that dust creates that barrier between the foot and the floor. So anything like that would be, I would say, the most common causes from the perspective of the hazard that's being introduced. Obviously, the way we can overcome that is if we could theoretically keep all floors clean and dry, perfectly clean and perfectly dry, no slips would happen. The reality is that's not possible. There are areas where, in buildings and outside, of course, where it's impossible to keep floors perfectly clean and perfectly dry, and therefore we need to think about all these other kind of factors that play a role. Hi, Helen. Thanks for joining us. Have you got a question you want to ask, or does somebody else want to nominate a colour or a number, and we will. I'll move on to the next one. I'm just going to check here because I'm monitoring quite closely on LinkedIn, but I've just realised I'm not really monitoring that closely on other places. So let me just have a quick look and see if we're getting any questions from elsewhere. But if anybody does have a question on LinkedIn or on the Zoom, or they want to give me a number to ask, then feel free to do that in the meantime. This is one of the difficulties of doing this kind of event. Perhaps I'll learn not to do them in the future. But I find it's good fun to do these Q&A sessions. Right, let me just check this here. Where are we? Okay. My groups. Very. Okay, cool. So somebody's asked for number 3. All right, number 3. Let's do the magical remove number 3. How can I tell if I have a slip or a trip risk? So we've talked just a minute ago about what are the common hazards or the common causes. So obviously we can be spotting those and looking out for those. I guess I would say a couple of things here. The first thing is we've got a perception gap or a potential perception gap to overcome. So I mentioned before that many people feel that slips, trips and falls is a kick the can down the road kind of problem, or it's not that serious for us right now. And you often hear comments like, well, we've had a couple, but that doesn't seem too bad. So to give a bit of perspective on this, if you look at the number of people that go to A&E each year in the UK after a slip, it's about 300,000. If you look at the number of insurance claims that are made after a slip, it's more than that, but it's not millions of claims. Yeah. So what you need to think about is those are the more serious end of slips. So let's say there's 400,000 to use a round number. How many buildings are there in the UK where somebody could slip? And the answer is multiples of that number. So the average building, if you just do that pure and simple maths, has something like 0 point something slips. serious slips per year. So if you've had one or two or three, actually you're well ahead of the curve. So that would be an indicator of I have at risk because I'm having accidents. Um, so that's one way of looking at it. The other thing I'd say is you'll just know. I regularly do polls on LinkedIn asking questions such as, have you walked on a floor in the last week that you thought was slippery? And the majority of people always say yes. You will know if you're a safety leader, uh, whether some of your floors in the buildings that you oversee are a bit slippery. You'll just know because you'll get some feedback, you'll feel it for yourself, you'll have that sense. And I once heard about an advert that I think was on a billboard, and it was very successful. And it said, if you think you need therapy, you probably do. And apparently, this advert drove lots of people to go and do therapy because they realised actually, yeah, I've got it. So in that context, if you feel you might have a slip or a trip risk, you probably do. Would be an equivalent for that. And so I think I would use those bit of data, bit of feeling, bit of a sense of understanding, and kind of use that to be a bit of a north star on this. Helen says she doesn't have audio. I'm hoping everyone else has audio. Nobody else has told me they don't have audio, so I'm hoping that everyone else does have audio. It might be something for you, Helen. I'm sorry about that. You can always watch the replay or listen to it back on YouTube or on the podcast or whatever it might be. Okay, someone's asked for number one. Again, do keep firing in your questions into the chat, or give me a number and I'll cover that number. I'm going to aim to do another few minutes. If someone slips, trips, or falls, does that mean we will need to pay out an insurance claim? The short answer is no, and here's the long answer. If somebody slips, trips, or falls, it doesn't necessarily mean you've done something wrong, is the first point. And the second point is that you don't have a legal obligation to prevent all accidents from happening. You have a legal obligation in the UK anyway to take reasonable, practicable steps to manage and mitigate the risk. So let me give you an example from the world of slips. I was interviewing on my podcast, which is called Safety and Risk Success Podcast. If you are a podcast fan and you don't happen to listen to it, I was interviewing David Scott, who is a lawyer that manages insurance claims for leading hospitality clients. And David was talking about somebody slipping on a poolside. And he said, if someone slips and the floor's wet on a poolside, their instinct is they're entitled to make a claim. And he said, no. Well, they're entitled to make a claim, but it doesn't mean their claim will be successful. If you are the operator of that pool, even if the floor was wet, even if somebody legitimately slipped, even if that person really did hurt themselves, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would be expected to pay out a claim. And he said, giving an example, if I, as the lawyer for that swimming pool, had some compliant slip test data to prove that the floor exceeded the HSE benchmark for safety, then I would expect to defend that claim. So if you go and sort of go slightly beyond the basics, and you start to introduce some science into managing your slip risk, and that's kind of what I talk about a lot, is this concept called slipology, introducing science into slip prevention. If we've got a bit of scientific data, such as a slip test certificate, which proves that we have taken those reasonable and practicable steps, and indeed, in that case, I would argue that you've gone beyond the reasonably practicable because you've kind of exceeded the HSE benchmark for what constitutes a safe floor in the world of slip resistance, then that is proof and evidence that you've fulfilled your duty of care. And the reason that that is so powerful is that it's not you saying you've done something or your policy says this or that. It's not something like a cleaning record, which we all know can be, shall we say, completed um, uh, in perhaps not the most um, you know straightforward manner in some cases. Trying to be diplomatic there. Um, this is kind of incontrovertible, third-party, scientific, HC approved data and evidence. So if you've got that kind of thing, then you absolutely should expect to be able to defend yourself in the event of a claim. So slip testing is very powerful, and I talk about the two big benefits of slip testing. One is understanding, quantifying your risk, and if you do have a floor that's slippery, you can then do something about it to reduce that risk and seek to prevent an accident from happening in the first place. But the other thing is that the slip test data is hugely valuable when it comes to defending yourself in the event of a claim. So even if you take all the reasonable steps, even if you do have floors that are safe per the HC guidance, it's still possible that somebody can slip. And that's when you want to have that fail-safe, that extra evidence, that proof that is going to help you to bat away that claim if it does indeed come in. Great. Well, if anybody's got any final questions, feel free to stick them in the chat. If not, then we'll start to wrap up. If you're interested in self-diagnosing your likelihood of someone slipping in your building, then I'd really recommend using our slip prevention scorecard. This is a online tool. It's a bit like an online quiz almost, where you log on to the URL, which is scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk. You answer a series of questions, and then in about 3 to 4 minutes, it's going to give you a result. And it gives you 6 individual scores for the 6 causes of slips, which are contamination, heel, individual, maintenance, environment, and surface. It's going to give you an overall score as well. And then what this does is it basically maps out where the building currently is doing well and where it's got room for improvement at driving down slip risk. So I'd really encourage you to go ahead and give that a go. You'll get a nice PDF report, you get some recommendations, and then there's the opportunity, if you want to, once you've done this scorecard, to book in for a call with me, and I can give you some extra advice, answer any questions you've got, share some best practices that have worked in similar organizations to yours or organizations that are not necessarily similar to yours, but have maybe the same presenting issues around this concept of chimes. And then we can see if there's anything we can do to support you to drive down the risk of slips. So do give the scorecard a go. Thank you for joining me today on this Q&A session. I really enjoyed it, had some great questions, and look forward to seeing you sometime soon. Take care, all the best. Cheers.